Many years ago, before modern air travel, the only way to travel across large bodies of water was by ship. Many passengers would crowd onto a large vessel for a lengthy journey to their destination. Unfortunately, when one of these ships sank, many passengers lost their lives because of too few lifeboats, icy cold water, long wait times for rescue boats, and lack of swimming skills. One well-known ship disaster occurred in the year 1120. A ship known as the White Ship struck a partially submerged rock and sank soon after departure. Only one person aboard the White Ship survived. From the AncientOrigins.net website, a story by Mr. Rees. Tragic accident or mass murder? The sinking of the White Ship leads to disaster for England. However, this was not just any ship that sank. The White Ship carried William Adelin, the son of King Henry I of England, heir and first in line to the throne. Due to the circumstances surrounding the sinking of the White Ship and the subsequent succession crisis, some have speculated that the sinking was not an accident at all, but the result of an event intended to disrupt the stability of the throne. Was the sinking of the White Ship a tragic accident with severe consequences, or was it the mass murder of hundreds orchestrated to get away with the murder of the future king? King Henry had a dozen children, and possibly more. Matilda and William were born to the king's wife, Matilda of Scotland, and the rest of the children were with his mistresses. While the king treated all of his children well and gave them all important government positions, William was the child positioned to take over the throne. Shortly before William's death, King Henry and the King of France had executed an agreement through which William would marry the daughter of Count Fulk V of Anjou. With this agreement in place, there was nothing stopping William from inheriting the Anglo-Norman Empire. King Henry felt secure knowing that his son would succeed the throne. In November 1120, everything would change. A fleet was being assembled to transport King Henry and his party from Normandy to England, a journey that required crossing the English Channel. Thomas Fitzstephen, captain of the White Ship, offered to transport the king across the Channel. King Henry declined this invitation, as he had already made his travel arrangements. But many in his party decided to travel aboard the White Ship, including William. Other nobles boarding the White Ship included Henry's illegitimate son and daughter, William's half-siblings, Richard and Matilda, and several others. All in all, more than 300 boarded the White Ship on November 25, 1120. According to the story as chronicled by historian Orderic Vitalis, the crew asked William to supply them with wine, a request to which he obliged in great quantity. Everyone on board consumed large volumes of wine, passengers and crews alike. Because of the excessive alcohol consumption, several people left the ship prior to departure, including Stephen of Blois, who came down with a severe case of diarrhea. Eventually the ship carrying the king disembarked, followed by the White Ship. The passengers on the White Ship urged Captain Fitzstephen to push ahead and to try and catch up with the king's vessel. The captain and crew were confident that the ship could reach England first. The crew rowed ferociously, fueled by their drunkenness from the wine. However, as the ship set sail into the waters, which were blackened by the nighttime sky, the White Ship struck a partially submerged rock. The port side of the ship was severely damaged, and the White Ship quickly capsized, sinking with hundreds aboard. Initially, William made his way to a small lifeboat and attempted to escape the sinking ship. However, he was drawn back to the wreckage when he heard the screams of his half-sister Matilda. As he returned to save her, the passengers in the water desperately tried to board the lifeboat, which could not sustain such a capacity. William drowned as the lifeboat sank. The White Ship sank in a location where people on shore, and even those aboard King Henry's ship, could hear the passengers' frantic screams. However, due to the darkness of night, it was difficult to tell where the screams were coming from, and no one was able to help the passengers. Tragically, only 2 people survived the sinking of the White Ship, a butcher Florent and Geoffrey de L'Aigle. Captain Fitzstephen perished, although it is said by some that he initially survived, but upon hearing that William had drowned, he chose to die rather than face the king for having contributed to the death of his son. Upon learning of William's death, King Henry was devastated. The sinking of the White Ship had a strong negative impact upon England. The death of William led to a succession crisis, and the country was gripped by a civil war known as the Anarchy. After William died, King Henry had only one remaining legitimate child, a daughter named Matilda, not to be confused with his illegitimate daughter Matilda, who had died when the White Ship sank. King Henry fought to ensure that Matilda would succeed the throne, but a woman had never led the country prior to this point. Although King Henry's barons swore an oath to support Matilda as King Henry's heir, upon his death in 1135, the barons hesitated to accept Matilda as the Queen Regent. Instead, King Henry's nephew, Stephen of Lewis, became king. Stephen is commonly viewed as having played a suspicious role in the sinking due to the fact that he was aboard the ship before it set sail, and that he left the ship due to a sudden illness, and he ultimately benefited greatly from the sinking, becoming king. However, some say that Stephen's chances of becoming king were too remote at the time of the sinking for him to take such drastic measures to achieve that goal. Matilda launched a war against Stephen of Lewis as she pursued what she believed to be her rightful role as leader. This tumultuous time, known as the Anarchy, lasted from 1135 to 1153 and resulted in great destruction and despair in England. Was the sinking of the White Ship a tragic accident due to wine-induced carelessness, or was it mass murder intended to upset the succession of the English throne? The answer may never be known. The mystery behind several vampire burials in Poland has been solved. People who were buried with sickles, the curved, sharp farming knives around their necks, or rocks at their jaws to prevent their corpses from reanimating, were natives to the area in which they were buried, according to a new study. From the livescience.com website, an article by Tia Gose. The mystery of the vampire burials solved. The fact that all the people buried as vampires were local suggests they may have been felled by a cholera epidemic that swept through the region, said study co-author Leslie Gregorica, a bioarchaeologist at the University of South Alabama. Tales of the dead coming back to life have truly ancient roots, going back to the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Babylonians and beyond, said study co-author Tracy Betzinger, a bioarchaeologist at the State University of New York at Wonâ. For all of these stories of the dead coming back to life, the word collectively used is revenants, Betzinger told Live Science. Tales of vampires have circulated in Eastern Europe since at least the 11th century, and newspaper accounts have described alleged vampires since the 17th century. For instance, in 1725, an Austrian official recounted the story of Serbian peasant Peter Blagojevich, who was said to have killed 9 villagers in his area before people staked him through the heart. Vampire lore at this time didn't require blood-sucking as an integral feature. Instead, the undead could slay living people with just a glance. In ancient lore, a person was at risk of becoming a vampire after death if she or he was unbaptized, died a violent death, was the first one killed in an epidemic, or was an outsider from another locale, Gregorica said. Notions that vampires drank blood may have arisen during plagues and epidemics, when corpses would often lie exposed and decomposing for long periods of time. People were up close and personal with death at this point, but didn't have a good way to explain what was happening, Gregorica told Live Science. For instance, the body tends to bloat after death from bacterial-produced gases. This pressure in the lower body in turn forces blood up from the lungs into the esophagus and then through the mouth, which may have led villagers to believe the corpse of a person who was waif-like and frail during life was fat from feasting on blood, she said. Gregorica and her colleagues analysed bone fragments from the Drasko Cemetery, a Polish site where vampire burials were found. The cemetery dates from the 17th to the 18th century, the researchers said. Some people at the site were buried with sickles under their necks or rocks under their jaws to prevent them from reanimating. The sickles were intended to decapitate the people if they tried to rise from the grave, while the rocks pinned their jaws shut so they weren't able to feed on the living, Gregorica said. The researchers then took a closer look at 60 of the 333 burials from the site, 6 of which were vampire burials intended to prevent a corpse from reanimating. The team analysed the ratio of strontium isotopes, versions of the atom with different numbers of neutrons in the skeletons. Because each location has a unique ratio of these isotopes, and people's bodies naturally take the elements up from the environment, analysing strontium isotope ratios can reveal where a person is from. Contrary to the initial hypothesis that the vampires were immigrants, the team actually discovered that all of the vampires were locals. Since none of the vampires showed signs of a violent death or severe trauma, the team speculates that the vampires were perhaps the first people felled in one of the cholera epidemics that swept through the area during the time. People could die of cholera in days or even hours, Gregorica said. If something kills you very quickly, it's not going to leave a mark on the bone, Gregorica said. As a follow-up, the researchers want to conduct more chemical analyses to see if they can learn more about these villages. A huge, mysterious door-like structure was discovered in the Huaymarca mountain region of southern Peru. Huaymarca, 35 kilometres from the city of Puno, has long been revered by local Indians as the city of the gods and has never been fully explored because of the rugged mountain terrain. From the coolinterestingstuff.com, Mystery of the Aramu Muru Gateway. Although no actual city has ever been discovered, many of the rock formations of the region resemble buildings and artificial structures. The door, or the Gateway of the Gods, has been at some time in the distant past carved out of a natural rock face, and in all measures exactly 7 metres in height by 7 metres in width, with a smaller alcove in the centre at the base, which measures in at just under 2 metres in height. According to some individuals who have laid their hands on the small door, a feeling of energy flowing has been commented on, as well as strange experiences such as visions of stars, columns of fire, and the sounds of unusual rhythmic music. Others have said that they have perceived tunnels on the interior of the structure, though nobody as yet has found a gap that would illustrate the door opening. On the contrary, the professional opinion is that there is no actual door, for the frame and the entranceway and the back of the alcove are all carved from the same rock. It is interesting to note that the structure undeniably resembles the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku and 5 other archaeological sites, which link together by imaginary straight lines, a cross with the lines crossing each other exactly at the point where the plateau and the lake of Titicaca is located. News reports from the region over the last 20 years have indicated sizable UFO activity in all of these areas, especially at Lake Titicaca. Most of the reports describe glowing blue spheres and bright white, dark-shaped objects. And if you'd like to see a picture of the doorway, just visit the show notes at www.origins.info and click on the links to episode 106 in the Mysteries Abound podcast show notes. Looks quite interesting, but probably is just a carving into the rock rather than a doorway. And from the Unsolved Mysteries in the World website, a story by Tripsybit. Mysteries of the McFarlands Bear. On June 24, 1864, Inuit hunters in Canada's Northwest Territories near Rendezvous Lake killed an enormous yellow-furred bear. According to eyewitnesses, the physical description's as follows. whitish buff to pale yellowish buff, darkening to pale reddish brown on the underside, broad head, ears set like a dog's, square, long muzzle, teeth are unlike the brown bears, presenting a combination of long canines and well-developed cuspids with broadly flattened surfaces. The cusps of the upper first and second molars are reduced, while the lower second molars lack the posterior cusp and notch. Wide at the shoulders, hair at the bottom of its paws, hind claws are as big as the front claws. Naturalist Robert McFarlane obtained the bear's skin and skull and shipped the remains to the Smithsonian Institution, where they were placed in storage and forgotten. Decades later, Dr. C. Hart Merriam found the specimen while conducting research at the Smithsonian. Upon closer study, he deduced that McFarlane's animal belonged to a new species. While the specimen resembled the grizzly more than the polar bear, the skull and teeth were different from those of all other living bears. The skull most closely resembled prehistoric species. Merriam named the animal Ursus inopinatus, the unexpected bear. In 1918 he went further, placing it in the newly created genus Vetulacatos. While Inuit stories about such bears continue, no other specimen has been collected. Theories concerning McFarlands Bear suggest that it is a freak grizzly, a grizzly polar bear cross, or a surviving representative, maybe the very last of a type that should have become extinct during the Pleistocene. Dr. James Halfpenny, a polar bear specialist, disputes the notion of a throwback grizzly, but remarks that grizzly polar crosses are documented. No one, however, has properly compared this specimen's remains to those of a known hybrid. The matter remains unsettled. McFarlands Bear is different from any other known giant bear, that much at least is certain. The brown bear, varieties or subspecies which include the grizzly, the Kodiak, the Penensub and the Kamchatka bear, is only one species of giant bear. 19th century hunter John Grizzly Adams once captured a live grizzly weighing 1,510 pounds. The other giant bear is the polar bear. One outsized specimen measured more than 11 feet tall and weighed 2,200 pounds. In 1943, Clara Helgeson reminisced about an incident many years earlier when hunters on Kodiak Island, Alaska, shot a large off-white bear with hair on the soles of its paws. Trees tend to be ignored because they don't do much, until you look closer. Then they just get weird. From unexpected forms of communication between themselves and other forms of life, to the deadly measures they take to ensure their own survival. Trees can rightfully demand a whole new level of respect. From thelistverse.com, 10 freaky things you won't believe trees can actually do. And this is written by Jana Louise Smit. Number 10, and there's actually a video with this one if you'd like to visit the show notes. They explode. If a military sadist that gives kindergarten names was ever allowed to design a plant, the sandbox tree would be it. Poison sits in nearly every part of the leaves, bark and pumpkin-shaped seeds. The entire 30-metre trunk deters tree huggers with its closely packed thorns. As the seeds explode with such force that people and animals can easily get injured. While this is a good way for the tree to spread its seeds for up to 40 metres away, the ejection speed is what makes it so lethal. Clocking in at a deadly 240 kilometres per hour, a nearby cow or human will actually get shot and can end up with serious wounds. If for some inexplicable reason a person decides to snack on the stuff, the explosive seeds can cause vomiting and diarrhea, and the tree sap is sadistically fond of ruining whatever it touches. It will bring about horrific skin rashes and blind the eyes. One thing is for sure, the sandbox tree is no indoor potted plant. Number 9. They employ bodyguards. It's kind of obvious that a tree is a lump of trunk that cannot shoo away any animals interested in a nibble. While it cannot help itself, this doesn't mean that trees are now on the free menu. They are known for hiring bodyguards, and nothing keeps a hungry herbivore away like an ant up the nose. The acacia tree has its own militia of hostile ants, which it rewards with shelter and a special food. And it's not just any old hamburger. It's laced with molecules called protease inhibitors that block a specific enzyme that bugs need to digest protein. In other words, it's a poor and dangerous meal for insects. Except for the tree's army of ants. When they eat it, it doesn't affect them in the least and is very nutritious. It's a good deal for both. One receives shelter and exclusive food they don't have to compete or search for, and in return, the ants attack anything trying to harm the tree. Number 8. Suicide. A newly discovered palm tree must kill itself in order to procreate. These trees spend so much energy in order to attract pollinators that they have no sustenance left, and they die soon after bearing fruit. Cashew farmers accidentally discovered this oddity in Madagascar's Analalava district and were dumbstruck by its mammoth dimensions. The 18-metre-high tree, adorned with sweeping 5-metre leaves, forms a pyramid-shaped plant so immense that it can be seen from space. Flowering is the point of no return for this rare giant. Hundreds of tiny blooms adorn the stem tip when it begins its fatal cycle, and these blooms contain copious amounts of nectar that are highly successful in attracting the desired birds and insects. Each and every flower can be fertilized, which is perhaps why the palm doesn't survive the mass fruiting. It literally gives up the nutrients it needs to survive in order to create the next generation. This certainly boosts Madagascar's weird wilderness factor. Number 7. They touch immortality. Trees are some of the oldest living organisms on the planet. Left in optimal conditions, there seems to be no limit on how old they'll become. There is a spruce alive in Sweden today that was a seedling at the end of the last ice age. This traditional Christmas tree is at first glance a disappointing sight, considering it's 9,550 years old. Discovered in 2004, the Norway spruce looks like a normal young tree, about 4 metres tall, but the secret to its longevity lies in its ability to clone itself. Whenever its trunk dies, a new one grows from the roots, which are the truly ancient parts of the tree. Mount Etna in Sicily is home to the oldest chestnut tree in the world, an old-timer, possibly 4,000 years old, and certified Guinness World Record holder for the largest girth at 58 metres in circumference. Some bristlecone pines from California's White Mountains have been watching the world go by for up to 5,000 years and are still going strong. With this incredible time-defying ability, it's tragic to note that trees in cities average a lifespan of about 13 years. 6. Make their own fertilizer. Researchers have discovered a new ability in trees that have been chopped down. Somehow the remaining stump draws nitrogen from the air and fertilizes the area around itself with this powerful nutrient for plants. Tropical forest plants are apparently quite good at this. After being logged, they also carbon capture from the atmosphere, which allows them a better chance at recovery. Nor are the trees stingy. The nutrients are released into the immediate area, which allows nearby plant life to also benefit from the captured plant food. This ability to draw nitrogen from the air is something trees can switch on or off, depending on the plant's needs, but only certain species can do it. During the early stages of forest regrowth, the difference in recovery between those that can and those that can't is markedly different. Tree species that lack this ability put on carbon weight up to 9 times slower than their nutrient-fishing cousins. Number 5. Amputate limbs. Trees cannot heal a physical wound like a human does. In order to remain healthy and alive, a tree needs to be energy efficient and recovery is just an unaffordable drain on resources. Instead of applying a band-aid and mustering up some healing, the plant blocks off all life to the injured part, effectively abandoning it. The benefits of this are twofold. Not only does this shut the door solidly in the face of nasties that could further infect the entire tree, but it can now spend its valuable energy on new growth somewhere else. However, amputation is not a fail-safe survival switch. Sometimes the wound is just too large or infected, and the sickness and rot eventually kill off the tree. But when it does work, the damaged cells start the process through leaking their contents, which then oxidise and form the life-saving barrier. As time passes, the wound will eventually close up as every year's new growth forms around it. Number 4. They have audible angst. French scientists have recorded a sound trees make when they undergo drought stress. They don't ask for a cup of tea in a parched voice. Oh no, trees get weird. They bubble. But by the time they're blooping somewhere in the ultrasonic range, a dangerous process is already occurring that can prove fatal to the unlucky bubbler. To get water to all of their extremities, trees suck the life-saving liquid under the pressure of several atmospheres through special tubes called xylem. During a drought, the plant must increase this pressure, but in doing so air bubbles form that can interfere with the water flow. And these are the stress sounds now audible to the right microphone. Scientists call the phenomena cavitations, and since too many cavitations can kill trees, sometimes endangering valuable plantations, it's crucial to know when they start. The French scientists are aiming to eventually create a device that can capture this ultrasonic noise in order to alert forest managers when a tree needs an emergency watering, or even automatically activate a watering device. Number 3. Molecular memory. During a study of genetically identical poplar trees, researchers found that the specimens responded to their present environment based on what individuals had gone through in the past, pointing to some sort of memory at molecular level. Researchers took stem cuttings from poplars, and apart from the fact that the cuttings came from 2 different nurseries, everything else about the experiment that followed was identical. The genes of the cutting species and the environment in which they were raised were all the same to allow researchers to notice any difference in reaction. And they got it. Simulating drought for some while watering the rest, the scientists expected the poplars to all react the same since they were in effect genetic clones. But the trees from Alberta activated a different group of genes in response to the drought than the poplars obtained from Saskatchewan. This pointed to the plants remembering where they came from. Number 2. The language of leaves. Perhaps leaves is the wrong word here. Trees do not use sign language with their foliage to greet others in the morning. They would just freak everybody out. Communication between trees happens subtly and below ground. Suzanne Simard, a forest ecologist, has made the unprecedented discovery that forest trees communicate and share resources with each other via their roots. With the help of symbiotic fungi, trees can actually feed seedlings with the nutrients the youngsters need to survive. This fungal network also allows bigger trees the opportunity to swap necessities like water and carbon with other trees, depending on their needs. Simard also identified the phenomenon of mother trees, the really old and massive trees in a forest. Not only are mother trees connected to all the other trees, but they seem to be the heartbeat of the woodland. They control and dispense resources through the massive fungal web, and when such a matriarch is chopped down, younger trees face a reduced survival rate. Number 1. Arson as a competitive edge. Wryly named gasoline trees, the popular eucalyptus tree is almost designed to prepare the groundwork for a devastating bushfire. Their broad ribbons of dry, peeling bark create tinder all over the place, made even more dangerous by the extremely flammable oil it produces. This combination is what makes this tree the firefighter's arch enemy, because it can turn a manageable ground fire into an uncontrollable firestorm in minutes. In 1991, over 3,000 homes and 25 lives were lost after eucalyptus trees caught fire throughout the Oakland Hills in California. After such sweeping wildfires, eucalyptus babies thrive without a problem. During their first couple of years, the young trees will grow intensively, sometimes at the cost of other species that can't keep up. Despite their arsonist nature, eucalyptus trees remain coveted for their strange beauty, fast growth, and prized essential oil. The Mysterious Disappearance of the Anjikuni People by Savannah Cox. And this is from the allthatisinteresting.com. One bitter night in November 1930, an exhausted Canadian fur trapper named Joe LaBelle sought refuge from the cold and inadvertently stumbled across one of history's most remarkable mysteries. The once industrious Inuit village on the shores of Lake Anjikuni that LaBelle had seen throughout his travels had vanished without a trace. Trudging through the fresh snow, LaBelle cautiously approached the silent village in search of shelter. Still steaming, grey streaks emanated from a charred pot of stew and eerily wove themselves through the night sky. Clearly, LaBelle mused, someone had to be around. Searching further, LaBelle checked the huts and found clothing and food, two things you certainly wouldn't leave behind if abandoning a village, both in large amounts to last the Inuits throughout winter. And yet LaBelle didn't come across a single soul or sled dog, and what's more, no footprints lay in the snow. Terrified, LaBelle traversed the sub-zero terrains and made his way to the nearest telegraph office, where, severely frostbitten, he sent a message to the Canadian Mounted Police for help. On arrival, they searched the village thoroughly and made a horrifying discovery. In the village burial ground, every grave had been unearthed and lay empty. An entire pack of sled dogs, which had been starved to death, was also found just beyond the village, having been buried under 12 feet of snow. To add to the mystery, the Mounties reported seeing a blue light that night, too artificial to be the northern lights, pulsing on the horizon before fading into darkness. Despite numerous investigations, the 2,000 Inuits were never seen again, and the tale of the missing Anjikuni tribe will be passed down through generations to come. And if you visit the show notes, there's a few photographs of the Anjikuni people and their village. Certainly a strange mystery, that one. And from the coolinterestingstuff.com, the strange disappearance of the SS Waratah. In July 1909, the steamer SS Waratah was en route from Durban to Cape Town. It unexplainably disappeared, with 211 passengers and crew on board. To this day, no trace of the ship has been found, but stories continue of sightings. The Waratah left Durban on the 26th of July with 211 passengers and crew. On the 27th of July, she passed the steamer Clan McIntyre. The ship's crew said that all seemed well and that the Waratah was making easy going of the rising seas and winds and quickly pulled ahead of their ship before disappearing over the horizon to the southwest. Later that day, the weather deteriorated quickly, with winds gusting up to 50 knots, combined against the tide and ocean swell to build waves up to 30 feet. That same evening, the Union Castle liner Guelph, heading north to Durban from the Cape of Good Hope, passed a ship and exchanged signals by lamp, but because of bad weather and poor visibility was only able to identify the last 3 letters of her name as T-A-H. The same evening, a ship called the Harlow saw a large steamer coming up astern of her, working hard in the heavy seas and making a great deal of smoke, enough to make her captain wonder if the steamer was on fire. When darkness fell, the crew of the Harlow could see the steamer's running lights approaching, but still 10 to 12 miles behind them. When there were suddenly 2 bright flashes from the vicinity of the steamer, and the lights vanished. The mate of Harlow thought the flashes were brush fires on shore, a common phenomenon in the area at that time of the year. The captain agreed and did not even enter the events in the log. Only when he learnt of the disappearance of the Waratah did he think the events significant. Reportedly, the Harlow was 180 miles from Durban. The Waratah was expected to reach Cape Town on the 29th of July 1909, but never reached its destination. No trace of the ship has ever been found. Some supernatural theories were also put forward to explain the disappearance of the Waratah. Claude Sawyer, who was booked on the Waratah but departed early, reported to the London Inquiry that he had seen on 3 occasions the visions of a man with a long sword in peculiar dress. He was holding the sword in his right hand, and it was covered in blood. The vision was one of the reasons why he decided not to continue on the Waratah. For 10 years, the residents of the Sicilian village of Caneto di Caronia have been utterly spooked by hundreds of mysterious, unexplained fires that seem to erupt out of nowhere. The bizarre phenomenon, which has seen a sudden surge this year, includes spontaneous combustion of mattresses, beds, cars and devices like fridges and mobile phones, even when turned off. From the odditycentral.com website, a story by Sumitra. The Italian village plagued by mysterious fires has been puzzling scientists for years. The episodes have attracted the attention of geologists, physicists and volcanologists for several years, but no one has been able to provide an accurate scientific explanation so far. Naturally, the villagers are blaming supernatural entities like UFOs, poltergeists or other demonic forces. And with no other logical reason in sight, one tends to wonder if they actually might be right. It all began in January 2004, when without any apparent cause, appliances like a cooker and a vacuum cleaner in several houses began to catch fire. Wedding presents, random pieces of furniture, and even a water pipe erupted into flames. In response, the local electric company tried cutting off the power to Caneto, but that made no difference. The village was evacuated and a thorough investigation was conducted, but the experts and authorities simply failed to locate the problem. Even with the arrival of volcanologists from the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology and a team of experts from the Italian Navy, no viable solution was found. Understandably, the villagers were terrified, and a few of them even suggested calling in a priest to conduct an exorcism. Months went by and a period of calm followed, when most of the villagers returned to their homes. Unexplained fires still occur from time to time, and the villagers have pretty much learned to live with them. Other bizarre events have also taken place. There were unexplained leaks from water pipes of 3 different houses. A vanity mirror in a bathroom caught fire 3 times in 35 hours. And an entire plantation of eggplants developed rainbow-like colours, making them unfit to be sold. Air conditioners have spontaneously melted, car glasses have imploded, hard drives have been erased, automatic gates started opening and closing randomly, and animals have died mysteriously. Without any science to explain these events, it's easy to see why the whole affair appears sinister. I'd be pretty terrified too if I were living in Caneto. In April 2005, the Italian government created a special task force of high-ranking army officers, engineers, architects, geologists and physicists to investigate the situation in the sleepy little village. The group conducted an extensively thorough analysis: aerial photo remote sensing, assessment of geophysical and geochemical data, detection of magnometric and electromagnetic fields, radioelectric spectrum monitoring, and more. The results, however, were inconclusive. In 2007, an Italian newspaper published a leaked interim report from the Civil Protection Department, concluding that the only plausible explanation was aliens, because the fires were caused by high-power electromagnetic emissions which were not man-made and reached a power of between 12 and 5 gigawatts. A year later, the case was dismissed following further investigation. They just attributed it to unknown electromagnetic radiation. But in the absence of tangible evidence, people have returned to supernatural theories. Sicily's council member for health and safety, Vittorio Alfieri, said in an interview that the fires were caused by an entity that transfers from one house to another. A house on the ground floor caught fire, then it was the turn of objects on the first floor, he said. Consequently, the fire moved to a nearby house. It was like moving. Now, after a period of respite, the inexplicable fires have returned to plague the citizens of Veneto. On September the 30th last year, a series of fires were reported throughout the otherwise peaceful settlement. First, a chair covered in cellophane caught fire for no apparent reason. Hours later, someone else called the fire department to report that a stack of folded clothes had burst into flames. And then an entrepreneur who was getting ready to drive away in his car but returned to get something he had forgotten in the house found his vehicle burning. A book and a sofa were also found scorched, for no apparent reason, in different areas of the town. According to media reports, the locals have once again been evacuated, while a small team of firefighters have been assigned to control the small fires. Several fantastical theories exist. Some have even gone as far as claiming that this could all be the work of a single individual who suffered strong emotional distress at a young age, a lot like Stephen King's Carrie, and is now attracting the curiosity of UFOs. Well, there's no limit to human imagination, and unless a real scientific explanation emerges, each theory is just going to be wilder than the next. And if you visit the show notes and click on the link to this article in episode 106, there are a few photographs of some of the fires that have started, as well as a short video. It looks as though the video may be in Italian though, but you'll get the gist by looking at it. Unless you can speak Italian, of course. From the YourGhostStories.com website, the Tower of London. I was there a couple of years ago, but I didn't really feel anything paranormal there, but maybe because it was during the day and there were hundreds of other people there as well. But let's see what this article's got to say. The Tower of London, dating back over 900 years, is known as one of the most haunted places in Britain. In 1078, the first stone section of the tower was built and commissioned by William the Conqueror. It slowly morphed over time, with additional structures and towers being added. Like Alcatraz, much human suffering went on within the cold stone walls, including executions, imprisonment and torture. It wasn't just reserved for the lowly criminal, but for the famous and powerful as well. Social stature mattered not for the Tower of London. One recorded haunting from the 19th century was from a crown jewel keeper, E.L. Swift. He and his family were having dinner in the Martin Tower when his alarmed wife spotted a moving object. Both he and his wife witnessed what looked like a cylindrical object, resembling that of a lab tube, filled with blue bubbling fluid. Tube or not, the wife claimed it tried to grab her. Not sure how a tube with no hands would do that, but it gave the wife that impression. The tube seemed to be an apparition as Swift tried to throw a chair at it, but it went straight through it. It then vanished into thin air. Of the famous that haunt the tower, there were reports that a headless ghost of Anne Boleyn meanders the eerie corridors of the White Tower. She was one of the two wives that were ordered for execution by her husband, Henry VIII. the other being Catherine Howard. Anne is also spotted in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she watches over her own grave under the altar. Catherine, on the other hand, can be heard screaming behind the door of the room she was kept in before her execution. Other famous ghosts are Thomas of Becket, who struck down the Traitor's Gate with a crucifix, witnessed by a priest. People have also seen 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, in the Bloody Tower, still wearing the white gowns they were imprisoned in. Foggy figures, soldiers and a 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey haunt the battlements of the Tower of London. Whole squads of soldiers have been seen marching the grounds. This place has no shortage of ghosts, as you can see. These famous rumours intrigued the BBC, and they teamed up with paranormal investigators to try and capture some of these ghostly images using special cameras that convert nighttime into day and infrared light, aka black cameras. They also used temperature gauges and other devices to prove or disprove some of these haunting claims. Though they could disprove much of what seemed odd about the tower, there were still 10% of their experiences that baffled them. They also came away with wonderful images, including unusual orbs of light. They claimed they were much less sceptical after their investigation. The final interesting tidbit about the Tower of London is that there are always ravens present at the tower. It is the legend that if the ravens were ever to leave the tower, England would perish. While some ghosts seem to be lost and confused in their altered state of existence, others, like this one, seem to be watching us and perhaps even destined to deliver an important message. From the paranormal.about.com website, The Ghost of the Pink Lady by Stephen Wagner. Dee lives with her family in Texas, renting an old house for the past 4 years. She had never had a problem with the ghost that she felt lived there until April 2002. From that time, her relationship with the spirit that has become known as the Pink Lady would be a mixture of dread, bewilderment and thankfulness. Here is Dee's own story of this unrelenting ghost and the effect it has had on her family. It was Easter Sunday, and members of my extended family were over for the annual dinner and egg hunt. All the kids were in the backyard jumping on the trampoline, while the adults sat around front talking and catching up. My husband, who is considerably older than I'm 26 and he's 59, went into the back to check on the kids. For some reason he decided to get up on the trampoline with them. His reflexes not being what they used to be, my husband fell off of the trampoline, crushed his ankle and was knocked unconscious. While all of this was going on in the backyard, I was in the front talking with my cousin. Suddenly something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned and saw this lady whom I didn't recognise standing at the edge of my yard. She was dressed in a very nice yet quite simple pink sundress, with matching pink shoes and a pink handbag. I knew no one in our neighbourhood who looked like her, and couldn't imagine who would just walk up into my yard like that. As I looked at her, she said, "He needs you now." I was mortified. I told my cousin I had to go and check on the kids. As I rounded the corner to the back, my son was running to me to tell me about his dad. We called 911 and he was rushed to the emergency room. He spent 3 days in hospital, and for those 3 days the Pink Lady never seemed to leave my side. She was right there everywhere I went. When I was home with the kids and when I was at the hospital with my husband, I saw her several times. She seemed to be watching my every move. The day my husband came home from the hospital, he was very weak from the painkillers they had given him, so I had to help him up the front stairs, into the house and into bed. I eventually got him settled, and when I turned to get his drinking glass, there stood the Pink Lady. But this time her demeanour was quite different. Over the 3 days I had seen her, when my husband was in the hospital, she seemed to be just watching and thinking. But now she looked angry. I quickly walked out of the bedroom, and when I turned to close the door, there she stood in the doorway. I left the door open, never considering I could ask her to move. For one thing, I seemed to be the only one who could see this apparition, and my husband would have thought I was crazy for talking to the doorway. Secondly, who knows what the spirit's reaction would have been? I tried to put her out of my mind and went to the kitchen to start preparing dinner for the kids. But the Pink Lady wasn't going to let me off that easily. I had always known that there was a ghost in my house. I had felt the presence and just knew. But now to have her there, watching me and letting me see her watching me, was very unnerving. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and said, "What do you want?" She didn't answer, but just vanished. Apparently the Pink Lady decided this was not the time for a confrontation. That was fine with me, and so the kids and I had our dinner. I was about to clear the table before going in to check on my husband when she appeared again. I was standing there in my kitchen with an armful of dirty dishes, and this spirit glared at me with the look of total disgust on her face. "So he could come last behind everything else," she said. I was so horrified at this admonishment that I dropped the dishes. I ran into my bedroom where I found my husband trying to reach for his pain pills. He had apparently been lying in the bed in severe pain, but because he knew I was cooking for the kids, he did not call out for me. That was when I realised what the Pink Lady had been doing. She had showed herself to me in an attempt to make me see the obvious. I was neglecting the most important things to take care of the most mundane. But who was this spirit? I have since discovered from my landlord that his mother lived in this house for nearly 50 years before she died. Her favourite colour was pink, and she loved to wear sundresses. I asked to see a picture of his mother, and he showed me the only picture that had not been lost when his own home burned down. The picture was black and white, but the landlord provided details of the colours. His mother was standing on what was now our front porch, in a pretty pink sundress, pink shoes with a pink handbag, just as I had seen her. Furthermore, the photo was taken on Easter Sunday, 1940. I may be wrong, but it seems to me that the Pink Lady was enjoying our family gathering right along with us, and when my husband got injured, it disrupted our celebration as well as hers. Then I guess she didn't think I was taking such good care of my patient, so she stuck around. Once I realised that I had to pay closer attention to my husband's needs while he was out of commission, she stopped hounding me. I have not seen her since that day she admonished me, but I still feel her presence. She is no longer intrusive, but the Pink Lady is still there. And also from the paranormal.about.com, a haunting in Kentucky. A mother tells the true story of a mysterious force that tore through her house, pushed her children and terrified her father. How or why a particular place becomes haunted is a mystery, although theorised contributing factors range from certain environmental conditions to the residual aftermath of human tragedy, suffering and death. But these factors are of little concern to the families that live at the centre of the paranormal activity. They only know that their houses are disrupted, their routines shattered, and their children feel threatened. Lainey had no idea what lay in store for her family when they moved into what they thought was a cosy Kentucky farmhouse. There was something there, a presence that might only have been curious about these new tenants. Or was this force something more sinister? This is Lainey's story. These incidents occurred over several months from June 2000 until we moved in October 2001. My family rented a large farmhouse in the Oakland area of south central Kentucky. From day one, something was unsettling in this home. The first night we spent there, my husband and I were in bed being intimate, and I heard a man laughing from the vent by the stairs. I heard it 3 times, but my husband did not. Trying to ignore the obvious, I put it out of my mind. It was days later and my kids had begun seeing things. They were about 5 and 6 years old then. They saw a strange orb hovering in their room one night and were terrified. They had described it as having a face, like a floating bubble that had a face. Another time they described a light with a tail coming from it out of the ceiling and moving all over the room. They heard taps on the window a lot too. Activity picked up and we had the usual creaky footsteps and sounds that went bump in the night. The house was 2 stories and we decided to make a playroom for the kids upstairs. I always felt on edge up there, like someone was watching me. One afternoon my kids were playing up there and heard something that frightened them. They both went running down the stairs, and as my younger child got to about the middle of the stairs, some invisible force shoved him. He fell, as my older child was several steps behind, and he saw how his brother's feet were made to come right out from under him. It wasn't as though he'd tripped, it was something unexplainable. Trying not to alarm or feed into the phenomena, I played it off time and again. Then a friend came to visit. Showing her our home, we went upstairs. She looked around, rubbed her arms like she was cold and said, "Let's go down." She actually ran down the stairs and immediately out the door. She then confided to me that my house was haunted. I told her I knew, but didn't know what to do about it. Not long after this occurred, my kids had finished a large puzzle upstairs. We all went out and returned later to the lights being on in our home. Not one, but several. My husband went in to investigate. Finding nothing, we all went in. Going upstairs, we discovered much of the upstairs ransacked. Things were moved, some things stacked up oddly, and then there was the puzzle, looking as though it had been blown apart from the middle. Pieces remained in one small area, and others were spread outwardly from the corner of the room to the other. It was so eerie, we never did find all the pieces. I gave birth to a 3rd child, and the intensity of the strange activity increased in the home. One day the kids came running down and said there was something upstairs in the closet. Being tired of this, I stormed up there, opened the closet, and walked in, and attested that there was nothing in there. Suddenly, some large object dropped next to me, but I did not see anything. It was something heavy. I even felt the floor shake as it hit. We instantly ran out of the house. I tried to reason that maybe a squirrel was in the attic or something, but the kids knew better. They had been having nightmares in which a frightening man was the main agitator. They also said the dreams were not like others. These were so vivid and real. Although I never saw anything, a presence was obvious. An ominous, eerie, cold presence. I discovered that the man whose family built this farm and who resided there until his death, sometime in the early 1970s, died of a massive heart attack just down the road from this home. His wife lived there until just shortly before we rented the home, and there was only one family of renters before us. I finally put it all together, how the candle wax on the hard floors in the kids' room and upstairs were likely signs of a séance. I suppose a portal might have been opened, and this was revealed to me in a dream. I saw people sitting around and chanting. This dream was vivid too. I began praying more and trying to ignore all of the terrifying signs. The most frightening experience occurred soon after this. My dad came to visit from out of state. We never spoke a word of this activity to him. He slept upstairs, where I had an extra bed. My dad is not one to believe in hauntings or anything paranormal. Well, my dad was to stay 3 nights. The first morning I heard him come downstairs before 4 a.m. I was up with the baby and came into the kitchen with him. He'd already made coffee. He said he didn't sleep well. A short time later he gathered his belongings and decided he needed to get back home, that he was going to be on call for his job, so he had to leave that day. I was confused and upset that he wasn't staying. He called me the next day and told me he was sorry to leave, but something was bugging him. He then confessed that he had heard someone upstairs in the night right after he drifted off. He heard heavy footsteps, and as he heard them approach, he looked. The figure of a lady entered the room. She was white and transparent. She walked towards him and disappeared, but the sound of her footsteps continued until it reached the bed. Then it sat down. An indentation was beside him on the bed. He was frozen with fright and closed his eyes. Then as quickly as it came, it left. I couldn't get out of that frightful place fast enough. I was so relieved to move. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth for the podcast is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are held at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. And don't forget our Facebook page, lots of friends on there, about 222 or something like that now, so it's a great number. Facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just click on the link at the show notes. And it's a big thank you to Sean Yarnell, Brian Bigler, Robert Kundick, Jeff Chapman and Scott McClory for giving a donation to the podcast. Thank you everyone, your support is greatly appreciated. And to bring episode 106 to a close, we're not doing a story from thecreepypasta.com. And besides, you had plenty in the last episode. From the www.cracked.com website, a story by Kathy Benjamin. 4 everyday things that caused huge panics when they were new. Nuclear war, global warming, ISIS. There are a lot of very serious things that people worry could destroy civilization. And to be fair, a lot of times that concern is justified. But then there are the other times. The times that society has had total freakouts over things that now seem completely innocuous. It is almost like we constantly need something to be panicking about, proving that the next generation is going to be so much more worse than ours. Bring some of these up next time your grandma insists that selfies are a sign of the apocalypse. Number 4. The Postal Service. While the only people who use the post office today are eBay buyers, who are too cheap to spring for actual shipping, there was a time when the whole idea of regularly delivered mail was considered revolutionary. At least it was until it became clear women were going to ruin everything. This is basically how corresponding worked before countries started nationalising the postal service. A woman would write a letter and then give it to one of her parents or her husband. If they were rich enough, a servant would then be dispatched to deliver the letter. Or if the recipient lived far away, they would give it to a guy on a fast horse, and the person on the receiving end would pay for the letter. Why all the hassle? Because this system ensured that everyone knew who women were writing to at all times. That all changed when author Anthony Trollope, while working for the newly formed postal service in the United Kingdom, had pillar boxes installed all over England. These, along with newfangled stamps, meant that suddenly women could correspond with whoever they wanted. And everyone knew that the people they really wanted to exchange letters with were men of questionable character, who were going to get them to do sex stuff before marriage. According to people in the 1850s, allowing a woman to write a letter and then post it without anyone in her house ever knowing was going to throw the whole world into chaos. Women obviously could not be trusted to contact only respectable people, and once they started sending letters unchecked, who knows what kind of things they would get involved with. Sex things. Even Trollope, the guy who pioneered the pillowbox revolution, regretted it the second he realised it was going to give women a tiny bit of, probably sexy, freedom. But this was nothing compared with the utter destruction of society that the post office was going to bring to America. In Britain, even if you managed to mail a letter in secret, the reply would be delivered to your house and you could be found out. But women in America picked up their letters at the post office, even renting boxes there, just like we can today. According to one pseudonymous writer at the time, having clandestine correspondence with unprincipled men was already affecting 1,000 schoolgirls a week and opening their minds to abnormal channels. He claimed maidens had started hanging out in post offices, specially to lure these ready and willing stamp sluts into a life of prostitution. It sounds insane, but respectable ladies turning to whores, all because they had control over their correspondence, was such a common concern for men that when Congress was debating implementing home delivery like they had in England, one of the arguments in its favour was that women would no longer need to go to the post office, and presumably that their husbands or fathers could once again see who they were getting letters from, thus stopping all that civilization-ending postal-related sex they must be having. Number 3. Sofas. It seems bizarre to us today, but for most of human history, people were really uncomfortable. Furniture was usually made by the family out of whatever wood they had available, and even if it was purchased, the only place you could get really comfy was in bed. So of course comfort became associated with, yes, you guessed it everyone, sex. And as we saw in the last entry, sex is usually what people think is going to ruin the world. The modern sofa was introduced to the West by Thomas Chippendale in 1748. And while his name may make you think of sexy, sweaty guys now, his designs don't exactly scream, "Let's do it." But Europeans had heard about these exotic sofas before and knew that the second people got a little bit comfortable outside of the bedroom, they would never stop having sex with each other, and that would be the end of civilization. They had all the proof they needed. After all, the ancient Greeks and Romans had sofas, and look what happened to them. A common theme on Greek pots and cups was men reclining on couches, pulling prostitutes towards them for non-procreation purposes. As if that wasn't enough, a popular book called The Sofa, A Moral Tale was published in French and English in 1742. The plot revolves around a man from the Middle East who is turned into a sofa, and the 7 couples who proceed to have sex on him. The message was clear to Westerners. Comfort leads to sex, and we are not having that here. As scary as the possibility of the world ending in a giant orgy was, rich people really liked being comfortable, so sofas eventually caught on. But leaning back on a couch also meant that it was suddenly necessary to have a place to put your feet, and so the ottoman was also introduced to the West. Suddenly, women's shoes went from clunky things to more like ballet slippers with heels, the better to show off their shape and ankle when they propped them up. And just like that, feet became the new sexy body part of choice for men. Number 2. Dancing. Dancing has always been controversial. As you probably remember, high school dancers had plenty of chaperones around to make sure that kids didn't grind too close. There are even religions and cultures in which dancing is completely forbidden. I know this is when you are expecting a joke about Footloose, but I've never seen that movie, so feel free to insert your own. Because society is so unbelievably predictable, this dancing hate-on has always been for one reason, and one reason only: sex. Since the beginning of time, people have seen vertical gyrations as the gateway drug to horizontal gyrations, and in many cases hoped that by prohibiting one, they could delay the other as well. Unfortunately for them, people like gyrating at all angles, and dancing has always been popular. This never made it less scandalous. For a long time, professional dancers were little better than prostitutes. In many cases, like at the Paris Opera Ballet School, they were prostitutes. Every generation has had its own controversial dance craze. Way back in the 1500s, it was the Volta, a dance that involved lifting the woman up in a way that exposed her knees. In the 20th century, the Charleston, the jitterbug, even Elvis Presley's hip thrusts were too much for respectable people to bear. These days it's twerking. But nothing comes close to the absolute moral panic caused in the 1800s by the introduction of the waltz. In 1816, the Times of London ran an article warning people about the dangers of this new way of getting jiggy. The indecent foreign dance called the waltz was introduced at the English court on Friday last. It is quite sufficient to cast one's eyes on the voluptuous intertwining of the limbs and close compressure of the bodies, to see that it is far indeed removed from the modest reserve which has hitherto been considered distinctive of English females. So long as this obscene display was confined to prostitutes and adulteresses, we do not think it deserving of notice, but now we feel it a duty to warn every parent against exposing his daughter to so fatal a contagion. And yet at the time, this snooze-inducing dance drove people crazy with its sensuality. One commentator called it choreographic rape. Even the poet Lord Byron found men and women dancing that close together to be a step too far. And this is coming from a guy who probably slept with his own sister. And number one, that place of decadence, the coffee shop. Ever since someone in the Middle East invented it, people have been obsessed with coffee. England might be famous for its tea-drinking ways now, but before about 1750 they were all about the jitter juice. And even though it might not make you more creative, coffee houses have always attracted the fake glasses-wearing, laptop novel-writing, pretentiously intellectual crowd. They were just harder to identify in the 1600s because the iPhone hadn't been invented yet. But King Charles II managed to figure it out anyway, and decided to ban all coffee houses in the country in 1675, and people were not happy. So why were coffee houses such a problem? Shockingly for this list, it had nothing to do with sex. It was all about politics. Sexy, sexy politics. The King's dad, Charles I, had been executed by Parliament only a few decades before, so the monarchy was still pretty shaky, and not from all the Java they were drinking. Coffee houses were quickly becoming the place to talk about serious stuff, like business and politics. Before, men had their discussions at the pub, but the rowdy atmosphere and ridiculous amounts of alcohol meant any talk of revolution never outlasted the subsequent hangover. But suddenly, important, smart men who wanted to talk about big things while mostly sober were going to coffee houses. This inevitably led to people there spreading rumours and criticisms about the monarchy, and the king was not having that. Talking about important stuff while not drunk was obviously going to lead to overthrowing the government and complete anarchy. It wasn't just the king who was against these coffee houses either. The year before he tried to ban them, a pamphlet went around London that ostensibly gave the feminine perspective of these dens of intellectual vice. According to the ladies, coffee made their previously manly men Frenchified, impotent, and turned them into chatterboxes who would not shut up. The combination of the consternation of their apparently sex-deprived wives and the king's concern meant that the men of England lost their coffee houses for 2 weeks. Due to huge public outcry, the king had to give in 2 days before the ban was set to take effect. While there might be more Starbucks now than there were in the 17th century, people back then were just as pissed about the idea of their wakey juice being taken away as you would be today. To celebrate the ban being lifted, the people of London all probably went and had sex, which no doubt resulted in the fear that repealing coffeehouse bans was also going to end civilization as we know it. Well, everyone, on that lighter note, it's time to close the podcast. So that concludes episode 106, and I'm sorry if you're having withdrawals about not getting a creepypasta story. If you do have withdrawals, well, you know where to find them, at the creepypasta.com website. So until next time, this is Paul saying bye for now, everyone, and keep well.